China's patience with Russia is running out. With North Korean troops now on Russian soil, Beijing isn't happy, and this unexpected alliance could shake up the entire conflict in Ukraine. On October 18, 2024, South Korean intelligence dropped a bombshell. North Korea had sent about 1,500 troops to Russia to support its war efforts in Ukraine. But according to Ukrainian intelligence, that was just the beginning. The real number may be closer to 10,000, with North Korean engineers and equipment joining the mix. Their mission to help Russia optimize North Korean weaponry for the modern battlefield. While the West is already alarmed by these developments, China's reaction is equally surprising. As Russia's lifeline through sanctions, China has kept Putin's economy afloat and has quietly supported Moscow from the sidelines. But the idea of North Korean troops stationed so close to China's border could be pushing Beijing's loyalty to its limit. So what's really driving China's unease? Will this surprising alliance push Beijing to rethink its stance on the war in Ukraine? With Xi Jinping's next move a mystery, the stakes have never been higher. But why would China's leader be so alarmed by North Korean troops entering the picture? As it turns out, there are some big reasons, and they could change everything. First, the reports of North Korean soldiers on Russian territory suggest that Russia is willing to call on other countries for direct military aid in the war. Russia justifies this action by implying that these soldiers would only be used to reinforce the Russian border, rather than being deployed to the front lines in Ukraine. That would be in line with the June Mutual Defense Agreement between the two nations. The agreement states that the countries are required to come to the other's aid when their territory is threatened. For Russia, this only became an issue in August 2024, when Ukraine launched its invasion of the Kursk region. This was a major morale boost for the Ukrainians and seen as a strategic victory at the time. It showed that they could present a real threat to Russia's own territory, even with only the limited supplies of advanced Western military equipment that they had been provided. The Kremlin's response to the Kursk invasion started off relatively muted, with what seemed to be little progress in reinforcing the region during the 3 weeks when Ukraine was pushing deeper into Russian territory. The counteroffensive only started in September, nearly a month after Ukraine pushed into the region. Since then, like in Donbass, they've been grimly, steadily grinding the Ukrainians back. By the time that reports of North Korean soldiers arriving on the Kursk front lines started surfacing, Russia had regained control of roughly half of the occupied territory in Kursk. With the slow progress in Kursk, it does make sense to deploy more troops to reinforce the border, both to prevent new incursions and to stop reinforcements arriving in Kursk. However, in the bigger picture of the war, Russia has pushed on with its offensive in Donbass throughout the Kursk incursion. So these troops that would supposedly be set up on the border probably wouldn't end up doing much. Even if Ukraine did try to snag another bit of Russian territory, that's not likely to be their focus in the near future. Ukraine needs its manpower most in the Donbass region, where the Russian forces are pushing ever deeper into Ukrainian territory at a speed not seen since the very beginning of the war. Additionally, Russia has been conscripting soldiers through mandatory military service for more than 30 months now. Even if that military service lasts only a year, recent estimates suggest that the Russian military has conscripted roughly 160,000 new soldiers every 6 months. That's a reserve of 300,000 troops. And according to Russian law, conscripts can't be deployed abroad. This means that Putin already has plenty of his own troops to reinforce Russia's borders, unless those troops are not nearly as well trained as they should be. This is supported by interrogations of conscripts taken as prisoners of war in Kursk by the Ukrainian military. According to some recruits, they were given only a few weeks of basic training and then shipped to their posts. So the North Koreans should be better trained than Russian conscripts. After all, North Korea has an 8-year mandatory military service period for men and 5 for women. But there are a few issues with that assumption. Firstly, the troops from North Korea are unlikely to have been trained in modern combat tactics, including the long-range drone warfare that's become such a prominent feature of the ongoing war. That means that they are unlikely to fare much better than Russia's own conscripts in the grand scheme of the war. Secondly, there are doubts that North Korea would actually send their top troops to another country, regardless of any geopolitical pressure to defend Russia's territorial integrity. It's far more likely that the soldiers sent to Russia were meant to perform the same role as conscripts or fresh recruits in the Russian military so far, cannon fodder. So if the troops aren't going to make a significant difference, why is China not happy about them being there? Well, Putin's reasoning for calling these men to defend the Russian border doesn't really make sense logically. If they're only going to be called to defend the border, the West might decide to do the same thing in Ukraine. If NATO decided to send well-armed troops to Ukraine to honor the country's territorial integrity, this would have the same result as Putin's own moves. NATO and Ukraine, of course, don't have a signed mutual defense pact like Russia and North Korea do, so this would be a serious escalation. No doubt Putin would likely make more nuclear threats, but this would certainly be crossing yet another of the red lines that he has frequently drawn over the past 33 months. But if Putin decides that the soldiers from North Korea were not going to be stationed defensively, but used offensively inside Ukraine, then all bets would be off. With a third country officially joining the conflict, the special military operation would devolve into a war that could escalate through many countries and regions. We could see direct conflict between NATO and Russia, plus of course the North Koreans. If this were to happen, it would leave China with a difficult choice. China has had its own mutual defense pact with North Korea since 1961. If NATO attacked North Korea, it would be obliged to come to its allies' defense. If China doesn't join Russia in the expanded war, most experts believe Russia is pretty much bound to lose a non-nuclear conflict against the combined forces of NATO. If NATO were to conquer Russia, China would stand to lose out on the cheap Russian resources upon which it depends heavily. These include oil, gas, and other natural resources like drinking water, minerals, and timber, which all come from Siberia. The resource-starved industry and water-demanding population centers of northern China would plunge into crisis. But if, on the other hand, China does join the war, its economy might not be able to support the effort. The US holds control over the Strait of Malacca, through which most of the naval trade between China and Europe, Africa, and the Middle East must pass. If China entered the war, the US would likely be called upon to take control of the Far Eastern front of the conflict. Then, the war could propagate to include the other members of the Quad, Japan, Australia, and India. The US and its allies in the Indo-Pacific could in effect blockade China from accessing the Indian Ocean and might be able to block off other naval routes through the East China Sea. China would be left with land corridors only to trade with Central Asia and reach ports in the Middle East and Persian Gulf. There would be heavy sanctions and embargoes. Railroads and highways are quite easy targets for NATO. China's economy might quickly collapse, especially if the war dragged on. But there's a third option. China might go to war against Russia itself. While the two countries are for all intents and purposes full allies, they weren't on such friendly terms throughout most of history. During the 19th century, Imperial China lost huge swathes of its territory to other countries, Russia included. Today's region of Outer Manchuria, which makes up most of the eastern part of the Sino-Russian border and connects Russia to North Korea, was taken from China by Russia during that time. While China has not made official claims on the territory, recent maps by the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources have relabeled all major cities in Outer Manchuria with their historical Chinese names. Additionally, China has stated all international maps should use those names. So why is Outer Manchuria so important for China? Apart from being a natural extension of one of the most densely populated regions of China, control of Outer Manchuria would open the door for China to take the entire Siberia and Russian Far East along with it. Due to the harsh conditions, Russia has relatively little control or infrastructure in the region, and it's sparsely populated. The two largest cities only have around 400,000 people each. But Outer Manchuria and Siberia are abundant in the natural resources that China sorely needs for its industry. Lake Baikal alone could supply the country with fresh drinking water for decades. When Chinese companies made plans to purchase the land surrounding the lake, the Russian government was forced to step in and pull the rug on the project amidst local protests. And that's exactly where the North Korean troops might come in. Rather than using them to defend Russia against Ukraine, Putin might use North Korea to create a buffer zone against China. With Outer Manchuria bordering North Korea, the logistics of transporting troops en masse to the region are significantly simpler than posting them in Kursk or other regions close to Ukraine. But why would North Korea agree to this? They have a mutual defense pact with China too, don't they? Well, while North Korea has been sending military equipment, including missiles and artillery shells to Russia, Russia has been sending food and other products to North Korea in response. The specifics of the trade between the two countries aren't published by either country, but trade appears to have grown considerably in recent years. On the other hand, China has become more critical of North Korea's provocative actions over the past decade. China has even expressed mixed feelings about the deepening ties between Russia and North Korea, citing concerns about the potential impact on regional security and its own relations with Pyongyang. So if North Korea has indeed grown heavily dependent on Russia as opposed to China in recent years, then it might very well decide that the risk is worth the reward, especially if it's being leaned on hard by Putin. And the North Korean military is anything but small. Thanks to its mandatory military service requirements, it's estimated that the country could draft around 8 million people in the event of a conflict. But even without these reserves, the active military personnel of North Korea is around 1.4 million people, which equals the size of the US's military and Russia's, if their numbers are to be believed. And with North Korea mobilizing, South Korea is likely to rapidly gear up its national defense capabilities too. Relations between the two are already as strained and tense as they have been in decades. At a minimum, South Korea would work against China on the same axis as Japan and the US, cutting off access to the East China Sea. That's why the North Korean troops in Russia are leaving China with no good options. Perhaps the best option is to wait and see what actually happens with these troops. According to some reports, some of them have already deserted their posts, using their deployment in Russia as an opportunity to leave North Korea entirely. But whatever happens, the mere presence of North Korean troops says something about the current state of the war. It suggests that Russia is starting to exhaust itself as a result of the war effort. For the past 2.5 years, China has been betting that Russia would win the war, at least eventually. By signing extensive and highly lucrative trade deals with Russia, China was able to gain much more from Russia being at war than otherwise. And when Russia won, China would reap the rewards of the former's expanded territory, population, and industry. It would be able to fuel its own industry and leverage Russia's access to showcase the waning influence of the West, thereby strengthening its own position in global geopolitics. But if Russia loses the war, there's no telling what might happen with its government. The alliance between Russia and China appears to be built around the strong personal relationship between Xi and Putin and their regimes. If Putin loses the war in Ukraine, he might be forced out of office, and the next government might decide to, or be compelled to, pivot back towards the West. This would be a mortal blow to the so-called equal, orderly, multipolar world that China is trying to build with itself at the head of the table. In the end, China might be thinking that Russia is finally starting to crumble, both externally and internally. If it were to collapse, it might be able to swoop in, take Siberia and its resources, and profit greatly. But if North Korea keeps defending Russia, then that plan might go out of the window, and China would be forced to keep supporting a failing nation, and that's not something that China would have much incentive to do. But what do you think? Will China take an official stance on North Korea joining the war in Ukraine? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.